Hello everyone, please tell me. Which city are you listening from? What time is it there? It happened. On a Thursday evening, the kind of gray, featureless day that never seems to begin or end. I had stayed late at the office, finishing something that didn't really need finishing, delaying the inevitable quiet of going home. By the time I left, the sky had dimmed into that strange in-between color, not night yet, but not day either. The air was still. The city was unusually quiet. The walk from the office to my apartment was short, only 6 blocks. I had walked that street 100 times before. The old bookstore on the corner, the small bakery that always smelled faintly of cinnamon even after closing, the lamppost that flickered at the intersection. Everything about it was ordinary, familiar, grounding. Halfway down the block, I stopped to tie my shoe. I remember the sound of it. The soft creak of leather, the whisper of fabric. I looked up for just a second. Or maybe it was longer. I can't be sure. And when I lifted my head again, the street was gone. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. The sidewalk beneath me was still there, but the world around it had changed. The lampposts, the shops, the parked cars, everything had vanished. In their place was a wide, empty expanse, stretching into mist. The ground beneath my feet felt the same, solid and real, but the air was thick, damp, almost metallic in taste. I turned in slow disbelief, expecting to see the familiar glow of the city skyline behind me. But there was nothing. Just fog. Endless low-hanging fog that swallowed the horizon. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I told myself I must have turned down the wrong street. Maybe I'd taken a side path without noticing. But I knew every inch of this neighborhood. There was nowhere else this could be. I reached into my pocket for my phone. No signal. The screen glowed faintly in the heavy mist, but no notifications appeared. No time, no battery icon, just blank white light. The silence was the worst part. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that pressed on your ears until you could hear your own pulse. I started walking, not sure which direction was forward anymore. The ground stretched flat and featureless, and the fog grew denser with every step. My shoes left faint impressions on the damp concrete, except they weren't quite concrete anymore. The texture had changed, softening beneath my soles, like wet paper. And then, faintly, I saw a shape ahead. Relief washed through me. A person, maybe another lost traveler, I called out. But my voice sounded wrong, muffled, distorted, like it was coming from underwater. The figure didn't respond. I walked faster, closing the distance, but the closer I got, the more I realized something was off. It wasn't a person, it was a doorway. Just a door, standing upright in the middle of the emptiness. Its frame weathered and chipped, as though ripped from some forgotten building. There were faint markings etched into the wood letters, maybe numbers, but they were too worn to read. I reached out and touched the doorknob. It was cold, too cold. For a moment, I thought I felt it pulse under my fingers, like something alive. I pulled my hand back. The mist seemed to move in slow spirals around me, coiling gently, as though stirred by some invisible presence. I took a step back, and that's when I heard it. A sound so faint it was almost imagined. the creak of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the fog, shifting, whispering against itself. The silence returned, and I felt a strange vibration in the air. Deep and rhythmic. Not sound exactly, but pressure. Like the pulse of a vast engine somewhere beneath the world. I took another step backward, and my heel brushed something solid. When I turned again, the door was gone. The mist thickened. The ground beneath me trembled faintly, like distant thunder muffled by miles of earth. I began walking again, though I no longer knew what direction meant safety. The fog seemed to move with me, breathing in slow intervals, almost synchronized to my own. And then, faintly, I saw the outline of buildings. Relief surged through me. The street had returned, or so I thought. But as I approached, the shapes came into focus, and my stomach dropped. They weren't the same buildings. The windows were taller, narrower, their glass dark and rippling, like water. The lampposts bent slightly at impossible angles, their light too white, too harsh. The bakery was gone. The bookstore was gone. In their place were doors, rows and rows of doors lining the street, all closed, all identical. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of it. I could feel something behind the windows, watching, waiting. The wind stirred faintly, carrying with it a low hum, not mechanical, but almost human, as though 100 whispers were overlapping just beyond hearing. My breath came shallow, visible in the cold air, and I realized that the fog wasn't dispersing. It was condensing, closer, thicker, and beneath it, I could make out movement, shapes, slow, deliberate movement. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose meaning in that place. The fog grew thinner, then thicker again, the street stretching endlessly, the buildings rearranging themselves whenever I blinked. Sometimes I thought I saw the original city in glimpses, the faint outline of my office building, the glow of familiar streetlights, but they slipped away like reflections on water. Eventually, I stopped. My lungs burned. I leaned against a wall, cold and wet beneath my palms. When I looked up, I saw my apartment building ahead. Relief flooded through me, real overwhelming relief. I stumbled toward it, every muscle in my body trembling. I climbed the stairs, turned the familiar key, and stepped inside. The light flicked on with a hum. Everything looked normal. My furniture, my books, the window overlooking the street. I sank into a chair, my heartbeat slowing. It was over. Whatever had happened, I was home. But as I sat there, I noticed something. The street, outside it wasn't my street. The lampposts were too tall. The sky was too pale. The buildings leaned in slight unnatural angles. And in the reflection of the window, behind me, there was movement, slow and deliberate, like someone standing just out of sight. I turned around, nothing. When I looked back at the window, my reflection was gone. The night had begun like any other, calm and quiet, the city lights flickering softly through the mist. I was walking along the old riverside path, my coat pulled tightly around me against the sharp bite of the autumn air. The moon hung high above, pale and round, casting silver light across the water that rippled quietly below. I often walked this path alone, seeking solace in the rhythm of my steps and the soft, almost musical sound of the river. But that night, something felt different, though I could not yet name it. She appeared suddenly, stepping out from the shadows beneath the skeletal trees. A figure so still, it was almost as if she had always been there, waiting. Her coat was dark, clinging to her frame in the damp air, and her hair shimmered faintly with the silver light. She did not speak, but her eyes, wide and unnerving, met mine, holding a gaze that felt far too heavy for someone her age. And then, with the slowest, most deliberate motion, she raised her hand and pointed toward the sky. I followed her gesture. The moon hung where it had always been, pale and luminous, but the sky around it had begun to change. Slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, the deep blue that should have stretched above us began to bleed into a darker shade, an unsettling, bruised purple that felt wrong. Stars twisted, flickering and wobbling like candlelight reflected in a storm-tossed pond. The air grew thick, heavy, and almost tactile, pressing against my chest and throat as if the atmosphere itself were watching, waiting. I wanted to speak, to ask her what was happening, but the words caught in my throat. The moon seemed to pulse faintly, a subtle swell of light that didn't match the natural rhythm of the night. And then I noticed the water. The river, which had always moved gently, reflecting the city lights, now rippled in strange, angular patterns. The reflections seemed to stretch upward, reaching toward the sky, and in their shimmer, I thought I could see shapes that moved independently of the water, bending reality subtly, impossibly. She stepped closer, her hand still raised, and I realized that the light from the moon seemed to respond to her gesture. The color of the sky deepened further, the purple giving way to an almost black shade tinged with deep red, as if the world itself were bleeding. The stars twisted unnaturally, streaks of light bending in impossible angles. I felt a shiver travel through me, a rising panic I could not articulate. Each heartbeat seemed louder than the last, yet my body felt heavy, trapped, as though I were moving through some viscous, unseen force. The whispers began then, soft at first, carried on the wind in a tone that was almost musical, yet unintelligible. They circled me, curling around my ears, brushing against my thoughts. I spun, searching the empty riverside, but there was no one else. Only her, standing unnaturally still, pointing, watching, guiding. I wanted to look away, to break the spell, but I could not. My eyes remained fixed on the sky, and with every moment, the colors shifted further, bleeding into shapes that felt like faces, mouths, and eyes that were never meant to exist. The trees around us seemed to lean inward, their branches twisting in impossible angles, brushing against the river's edge like fingers. Shadows stretched across the path in ways that contradicted the faint city lights behind me. My chest tightened as I realized the path I had walked countless times seemed altered. The familiar landmarks, the stone bench, the worn bridge, the old lampposts were still there. Yet somehow wrong, elongated, shifted, as though I had stepped into a memory that had been distorted. A painting of a place I knew, but not fully. I tried to speak again, but no sound came. My voice was absorbed by the air, replaced by the low hum that now vibrated through everything: the river, the trees, the very atmosphere. It pulsed in rhythm with the swelling color of the sky, a subtle heartbeat that pressed against my temples. I realized then that I was no longer walking. The ground beneath me had changed texture, almost imperceptibly, the cobblestones softening, then stretching, like fabric pulled too tight. I felt an urge to flee, but my legs moved too slowly, my muscles unresponsive. She did not move, her gaze unwavering. The sky reached its apex of unnatural color, a deep, impossible red blending into the black and purple, twisting around the pale moon as if the celestial body itself were dissolving. And then, in the reflections on the water, I saw something move behind her. A shadow, human-shaped but wrong, too long, too thin, stretched across the surface. It mirrored my own movements perfectly, yet there was no one there. My stomach churned as I understood. I was not alone, and yet nothing that stood with me could be truly seen. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to escape, but the air thickened, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. The river rippled faster, the reflections of the twisted stars and bleeding sky dancing on its surface like living eyes. Every instinct screamed to run, yet my feet barely moved. And then, with a sudden clarity that pierced through the confusion and panic, I realized she was not guiding me toward the sky. She was pointing at something else entirely. Something that existed between the colors, in the impossible folds of the sky itself, and it watched me with patience, deliberate, silent. And then it faded. Not abruptly, but gradually. The purple and red receded into normal night. The moon returned to its usual pale glow. The stars settled back into their proper places. The river rippled calmly again. The alley, the familiar path, the lampposts, they all seemed ordinary. She stood there for a moment longer, her hand lowered, the emptiness in her eyes still pressing into me. And then she vanished as silently as she had appeared, leaving no trace beyond the faint smell of damp earth and something metallic that lingered in the air. I walked home slowly, my mind replaying every detail, wondering what had just happened. The streets were quiet, the city calm, yet every shadow seemed to twitch. Every reflection in the puddles carried a hint of unnatural color. I have never walked that riverside path alone at night again. Yet sometimes, when the moon hangs low and pale, I see the faintest glimmer of purple and red along the horizon, and I remember the figure pointing upward. And I feel that silent weight pressing against me, waiting, patient, unyielding. Because some nights, the sky is not simply a sky. And some gestures, some eyes never truly leave you. It was late, later than I had intended to be out, and the city seemed to have folded in on itself. The streets slick with rain that gleamed under the weak glow of streetlights. I hurried to the bus stop, shaking off droplets of water, my coat clinging damply to my shoulders. The stop was empty. Of course at that hour, the city felt like a ghost town. The occasional echo of distant tires on wet pavement, the only hint of life. I checked the schedule. The bus would come in a few minutes. I waited, watching the reflections ripple in the puddles at my feet, feeling the subtle hum of rain vibrating through the concrete. When it arrived, the bus hissed softly as the doors opened, the familiar mechanical groan slicing through the quiet. I stepped inside and froze. The bus was empty, completely empty, except for the dim overhead lights casting long, pale rectangles along the floor. The seats reflected faint streaks of water from the windows, the world outside blurred by rain and darkness. I chose a seat near the middle, sinking into it and letting the rhythmic creak of the suspension soothe me. Normally, an empty bus would have been comforting, but that night it was anything but. There was a stillness that pressed against my ears, a silence so thick it felt tactile, as though the air itself had weight. I shifted, and the faint hum of the engine felt too loud, intrusive, like it was magnifying every small noise. The bus lurched forward slowly, then settled into its rhythm along the wet streets. I stared out the window, watching reflections of lights stretch and bend, and tried to relax. But something in the back of my mind insisted that I was not alone. Not just in the physical sense, but in a way that prickled my senses deep in my bones. I turned my head slowly, scanning the empty rows, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, no hint of movement. Only empty seats, faint reflections, and the soft, rhythmic thrum of tires over wet asphalt. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time became uncertain, a blurred smear of streetlights and puddles. I felt a shiver crawl across my spine and realized that every so often, I thought I saw someone out of the corner of my eye, something that would vanish when I turned to look. A shadow flickered along the side, too quick, too deliberate to be a trick of the light. The floor beneath me seemed to hum faintly with each turn, each slight incline, and I became aware of the faintest sound behind me, a soft, scraping noise like nails on metal, but distant, echoing across the empty seats. I turned fully, scanning the bus. Nothing, only the overhead lights, faintly buzzing, flickering with the rhythm of the city outside. I told myself it was my imagination. The rain, the darkness, the isolation, they were playing tricks on me. Yet a part of me could not shake the feeling of eyes on me, a presence crouched just beyond perception, watching, waiting. I adjusted in my seat, trying to calm the unease that had settled in my chest like lead. The bus rounded a corner too sharply, and the vibration of the wheels shifted the air around me, carrying a faint whisper, almost imperceptible, curling across the seats. I leaned closer, straining to hear, but it was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the oppressive quiet. The longer I sat, the more aware I became of subtle disturbances. Seats behind me would creak as though someone had just shifted. A soft brush of air moved past my neck, though the windows were closed and the ventilation off. Reflections in the glass seemed to twitch independently of the bus's movement, shapes forming and vanishing in the distorted city light. My heartbeat quickened. I told myself firmly, "You're imagining it. There's no one here." But the instinctive dread crawling over my skin said otherwise. I tried to focus on the familiar landmarks outside, to anchor myself to reality, but the streets seemed to stretch, buildings bending unnaturally in the rain. Every turn felt like the bus was carrying me somewhere I had not intended to go. My stomach churned as I realized I did not recognize some of the streets, even though I had traveled this route countless times. And then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate shuffle, far back, just behind me. I whipped my head around, and the back of the bus was still empty. The shadows were long and dark, but no one sat there. Yet I could feel it. Something had been there. I stood, approaching the back slowly, each step weighted with hesitation. The floor beneath me seemed to vibrate in time with my heartbeat, and I felt a pull, subtle but insistent, guiding me toward the last row of seats. I glanced down the aisle. The shadows stretched unnaturally, folding over themselves. The faint, echoing hum in the air seemed to whisper words I could not understand, syllables curling in my ears like smoke. I stopped at the back, staring at empty seats, my hands trembling. I whispered, "Hello," but my voice came back muffled, distorted, swallowed by the oppressive air. Then I noticed the reflection. In the darkened window, beside the last row, a faint outline of a figure appeared, standing just behind me in the mirrored glass. I spun around. Nothing. No one. The bus hummed, the rain pattering on the roof, the city outside blurred and silent. But the reflection remained, a shadowy presence, impossibly still, with no discernible features, yet somehow aware, watching, pressing into the edges of my mind. I sank back into my seat, gripping the edge, heart hammering. The rest of the ride passed in tense silence, punctuated by the faintest, almost imperceptible movements, a seat cushion shifting as though someone had brushed past it, a soft whisper curling around my ear, shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should. When I finally reached my stop, the bus hissed as the doors opened and the warm city lights spilled in. I stepped off, soaked in sweat, and turned back. The bus rolled away, empty, or so it seemed. Yet I could not shake the certainty that something remained behind. Tracing my steps, inhabiting the empty spaces in the bus, waiting for the next night, the next ride, the next passenger who thought they were alone. Even now, when I pass that route at night, when the rain is steady and the city quiet, I can feel it. Not in the street, not in the air, but in that subtle, impossible hum that only appears when the bus is empty, when it thinks no one is watching. And I wonder, sometimes with dread, if I had ever truly left it behind at all. I had been wandering the streets of the old town for hours, the drizzle turning the cobblestones into dark, reflective mirrors under the dim streetlights. It was the kind of evening where every shadow seemed alive, stretching and twisting with the gentle sway of my footsteps. My destination had been a small cafe I'd hoped would be open late, but the lights were dark, and the air carried the faint scent of damp wood and something unplaceably sour. I turned down a narrow side street I hadn't noticed before, drawn by curiosity more than any clear intent. That's when I saw the shop. It was small, tucked between two taller buildings, almost hidden, yet the dim light spilling from its windows gave it an oddly inviting glow. The sign above was faded and unmarked, the glass dusted with condensation. I paused outside, peering in. The interior was cluttered but neatly arranged, a cozy jumble of shelves, jars, and trinkets. Everything looked familiar and comforting, yet something in the air pressed against my chest. Silent warning I couldn't name. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, the warmth of the shop brushing against my damp coat. A scent hit me immediately, something like old paper mixed with honey, sweet but unsettling, clinging to the corners of my mind. Behind the counter stood the shopkeeper, He was older than I expected, small and hunched, dressed in a faded apron dusted with flour or perhaps ash. He smiled at me, a slow, deliberate curl of the lips, and it should have been reassuring. But his eyes, they did not smile. They were hollow, dark, almost reflective, like deep wells that offered nothing back. I tried to shake off the unease and greeted him, but his mouth moved without sound. My voice felt muted, swallowed by the air itself. I glanced around the shop. Shelves sagged under the weight of jars filled with things I couldn't identify: powdered roots, dried petals, tiny shards of metal that glinted faintly in the warm light. A small ticking clock hung above a cabinet, but its hands moved backwards, slowly, deliberately. The hum of the street outside had vanished, replaced by a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, like the room itself was breathing. He motioned toward a table in the center of the shop, a polite, silent invitation. I walked toward it, my steps unnaturally slow, though I couldn't feel my legs resisting. The closer I got, the heavier the air became, pressing against my chest, settling in my throat. I realized that the shop had grown slightly larger, its ceiling rising imperceptibly, shelves stretching just beyond the edges of my vision. The jars on the table seemed to shift subtly when I looked away, as though repositioning themselves with quiet intent. I asked the shopkeeper a question, my voice cracking slightly, but the words seemed to fall flat. He nodded once, slowly, and pointed toward a small cabinet. I opened it, revealing more jars, more objects, each labeled in handwriting I did not recognize, sharp, jagged letters that seemed to move faintly when I blinked. The air vibrated again, a whisper curling around my ears. Unintelligible but intimate, like someone speaking directly into the hollow of my skull. My heart hammered, yet my body felt sluggish, weighed down by a force I could not name. I turned back to him. He smiled again, the same slow curl of lips. His eyes remained empty, endless, impossible to look into for more than a moment without feeling a pull, a tugging sensation in my chest. I realized then that I could not leave the room, not yet. The door I had entered through now appeared further away, smaller, its frame slightly warped. When I moved toward it, the floor beneath me shifted, a subtle rise and fall that made my footing unsure. Every time I blinked, the shop seemed to rearrange itself. The shelves twisted slightly, the jars shifted, and the clock ticked backward, a quiet rhythm that seemed to mock me. Minutes, or perhaps hours, passed. I could not tell. The shop was timeless. The hum in the air grew, rising to a faint, almost musical pitch that pressed against my eardrums. I could hear whispers now, delicate, curling around the room, brushing against my thoughts, suggesting, coaxing. I wanted to speak, to call out, but my voice felt gone, absorbed into the fabric of the room. I looked again at the shopkeeper. His smile remained. His eyes remained empty. And for the first time, I noticed a subtle vibration in his hands as they rested on the counter. A faint, deliberate pulse that seemed to sync with the strange rhythm filling the air. I tried to step backward, toward the door, but the space stretched. The shelves leaned closer, the jars quivering faintly, as though the shop itself were aware of my every thought, every heartbeat. The whispers grew, faint but urgent, circling, tugging at the edges of my perception. I felt my sense of time unravel. The shop was endless, yet contained a loop of air, wood, and shadow that refused to let me go. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the room shifted. The jars stopped trembling. The whispers vanished. The air lightened. The door stood before me, normal this time, ordinary, the bell above chiming softly as if nothing had happened. I stumbled toward it, almost afraid to touch the handle, and stepped back into the alley. The streets smelled of rain and stone, the city ordinary once more. The shop was gone. The building wall was solid, unbroken, and the faint glow that had spilled from its windows had disappeared. I walked home slowly, every shadow feeling alive, every reflection in the puddles carrying a glint of hollow eyes. Sometimes, I can still see the shop in my mind's eye, and the shopkeeper's smile lingers on the edge of my memory. I have never seen him again, yet I feel certain that he watches somewhere beyond the world I recognize, waiting for me to wander down a side street, drawn by curiosity, by that quiet, insistent tug, because some smiles are not meant to comfort. Some eyes, no matter how empty, remember everything. And some doors, once noticed, are never truly gone. I had walked that alley 100 times before. The narrow brick corridor tucked between two old buildings, the kind of place you pass without a second thought. That evening, though, the city was unusually quiet. The hum of traffic muted by a steady drizzle that turned the cobblestones slick and reflective. My footsteps echoed softly, each tap of my shoes on the wet stones amplified in the stillness. The air smelled of damp concrete and rust, a heavy, earthy scent that seemed to seep into my lungs. And then I saw it. A door, small and unremarkable, set into the side of a building I didn't remember having a door at all. Its wood was dark, wet from the rain, and the handle glimmered faintly in the dim light. At first, I thought it must be some delivery entrance, perhaps long forgotten, or maybe a maintenance access that had been sealed. But something about it called to me, not in a loud, insistent way, but quietly, as though the alley itself wanted me to notice it. I hesitated, my fingers brushing the damp metal handle, and a strange shiver crawled up my spine. When I opened the door, there was a faint, almost imperceptible creak, as though the building itself sighed. A soft draft of air escaped, smelling faintly of dust and old wood, mixed with something else I could not identify. I stepped inside, expecting a narrow storage closet or a stairwell leading somewhere mundane. But the moment I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The air grew warmer, heavier, almost intoxicating, and the sound of the rain outside faded, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from all directions at once. The room was small, but strangely disproportionate. Its walls were paneled in dark wood, polished so that faint reflections glimmered across the surface. The ceiling arched high above, more than it should have been, and the single window was small and frosted, letting in no clear light but a diffuse glow that seemed to move like liquid. A faint scent lingered, vanilla old paper, and something metallic, like iron. I walked forward slowly, letting my hand brush along the wall, and realized that the room's geometry was impossible. Each step I took stretched slightly longer than it should have. and when I turned, the corners did not align the way they should have. I sat down on a small wooden chair near a table, noticing that it was covered in objects I did not recognize. Tiny trinkets, glass bottles filled with cloudy liquids, scraps of paper with jagged handwriting in a language I did not know. The air vibrated faintly with soft, unplaceable whispers, voices that were close but not speaking words I could understand. They did not startle me, yet they made my skin crawl, the unease settling in my chest like a cold stone. The room was quiet, too quiet, in a way that pressed against my ears, and I realized that I could not hear my own breathing clearly. I moved toward the window, pressing my hand against the frosted glass. Outside, I could just make out the alley, the familiar rain streaking past, yet something was wrong. The alley seemed longer, narrower, stretching into a fog that I had never seen before. Shadows moved oddly, flickering along the walls like smoke. I turned back to the room, only to find that it had subtly changed. The table was slightly closer to the wall, the chair shifted by a few inches, though I had not touched anything. My heart quickened. I tried to leave. I went to the door, twisting the handle, but it would not budge. It was no longer a simple wooden door but a smooth surface that resisted my touch, cold and unmoving. A soft, low hum filled the air, vibrating through my bones, and I noticed a faint glow in the corners of the room, shapes that suggested movement, though nothing emerged. I stepped backward, and the floor seemed to ripple, subtly at first, like the surface of water disturbed by a gentle breeze. I stumbled but caught myself on the table, which shifted again under my touch. Time lost meaning. I could not tell whether minutes or hours had passed. The whispers grew slightly louder, circling around me, ebbing and flowing like the tide. I realized that the objects on the table were not random. They were arranged in patterns, small concentric circles, spirals, and lines that seemed to change subtly when I looked away and back. I leaned closer, squinting at the jagged writing on the scraps of paper. It was not a language I knew, yet somehow I felt I could almost understand it, that if I concentrated, I could grasp some hidden truth I was not meant to know. The room itself seemed to breathe. Walls stretched imperceptibly, the ceiling rising and falling, the floor tilting just slightly underfoot. Shadows pooled in places they could not logically exist, shifting slowly toward me, as if drawn by some unseen current. I wanted to scream, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat, trapped by the hum and the subtle pressure of the air. My pulse raced, and I felt the edges of my vision blur, the room becoming a mosaic of shapes and colors that were almost familiar but wrong. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stilled. The whispers ceased. The walls stopped shifting. The light from the window froze in place. I could hear the rain again, soft and steady, tapping against the alley outside. I approached the door once more. This time, the handle turned easily, as if nothing had resisted me before. I stepped out, my shoes hitting the wet cobblestones, and the alley looked normal, narrow, dark, slick with rain. The city beyond shimmered in the wet light, entirely ordinary. But something had changed. The air smelled faintly of old wood and vanilla, and the reflections in the puddles seemed sharper, almost aware. I glanced back at the building, but there was no sign of the door I had entered. Just a blank brick wall, slick with rain. I walked home slowly, heart still racing, wondering if I had dreamed it, or if I had stumbled into a space that existed beyond the rules of the world I knew. I have never found that door again. I have walked that alley countless times since, in daylight and in rain, yet the wall remains unbroken. Still, sometimes at night, when the rain falls steadily and the city hums quietly, I can feel it. A subtle tug, a whisper in the edge of my mind, urging me back, and I cannot help but wonder if the room still waits, quietly breathing, reshaping itself just beyond the world I recognize, ready to welcome me again. Because some doors, I have learned, do not lead where you expect. They lead somewhere else entirely. Somewhere that is watching, and remembering, and waiting. I had always loved trains. There was something soothing about the steady rhythm of the wheels on the tracks, the gentle sway of the carriages, the muted hum that filled the space between stops. That evening, rain was falling steadily, coating the station in a silver sheen that reflected the flickering lights. I remember standing on the platform, umbrella dripping, feeling an odd mix of excitement and unease. The train arrived with a soft hiss, the doors sliding open like a quiet invitation. I stepped inside, letting the warmth and the faint scent of damp upholstery wash over me. At first, everything seemed normal. The train hummed along the tracks, the lights overhead casting a familiar, soft glow. A few passengers were scattered about, hunched in their seats, faces obscured by hoods or hats. The rain tapped lightly against the windows, a delicate percussion that mingled with the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. I chose a seat near the middle of the car, facing forward, and watched the rain streak past the glass. The world outside blurred into shades of gray and silver, the city dissolving into streaked lights, and I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were suspended in a bubble, separate from everything else. And then I noticed her. She stepped onto the train from the next car, a figure tall and pale, her coat dripping wet, hair plastered against her face. At first glance, she seemed ordinary, but something about the way she moved slowly, deliberately, without glancing at anyone made my stomach tighten. She walked past me, her boots silent on the worn floor, and slid into the seat across the aisle. She did not look at me, did not acknowledge anyone. She simply sat there, shoulders hunched, hands resting in her lap, staring at nothing in particular, yet somehow seeming to see everything. The train continued along the tracks, the sound of motion steady, comforting, yet a small part of my mind began to feel uneasy. I tried to focus on the rain, the lights flickering past, the rhythm of the wheels, but every few moments, my eyes were drawn back to her. She seemed off, almost impossibly still, yet there was a vibration to her presence, like the air around her was subtly distorted. And then I realized something. The sound of the train had changed. Not the clatter or the hum, but the very sense of movement. It felt flatter, hollow, as if the motion were only an illusion. I glanced at the window. Outside, the world streaked by in the same blur of rain, but I could see the reflection of the car, and something was wrong. My reflection wavered, and for a moment, I thought I saw her reflection staring back at me, not in the mirror of the glass, but from some other place entirely. My chest tightened, a subtle panic rising, yet I could not look away. I turned back to her, and for the first time our eyes met. She did not blink. Her gaze was empty yet insistent, pulling me forward, pressing against my mind with an almost physical weight. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the movement outside, but a creeping realization came over me. The train had stopped. Not gradually, not at a station, just stopped. The rhythmic motion of the wheels had ceased. The gentle hum had dulled into a strange, high-pitched vibration, almost imperceptible. I could hear the faint whistle of the rain on the roof, and the distant murmur of something else. Something like a whisper, carried in the corners of the car, brushing against my ears, just beyond comprehension. I looked around. The other passengers remained where they were, heads bowed, silent, frozen in a way that made no sense. I tried to stand, to move toward the conductor's compartment, but my legs felt heavy, as though submerged in water. Panic bubbled in my chest, but I could not shout, could not call out, could not even fully move. The air seemed thick, pressing down, a humid weight that filled my lungs and made my heart beat thunder in my ears. She leaned forward slightly, just enough for me to see her face fully. Her eyes were wide, unnervingly bright in the dim light, yet hollow, as though they contained some secret she could not share. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a quiet dread that pooled in my stomach. Then, just as suddenly, she straightened and the train began to move again. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the wheels whispered against the tracks, carrying us forward, but the world outside felt different, to gray, to still. Shadows lingered where they should not, shapes that suggested movement but disappeared whenever I tried to focus. I tried to speak to someone, anyone, but no one answered. The woman across from me was still, perfectly still, and the other passengers remained hunched, faceless and silent. The rain outside had changed. To it no longer struck the windows in natural patterns, but seemed to smear downward like thick, slow tears. I could hear faint tapping from somewhere deep inside the car, a soft, irregular rhythm that did not match the motion of the train. It was there, then gone, then there again, always too precise to be natural. By the time I reached the next station, or what should have been the next station, I realized something horrifying. The signs had not changed. The map, the lights, the faint advertisements along the walls, all of it repeated, exactly the same as it had been when I boarded. I was moving, yes, but nowhere. The train was moving, yes, but standing still. The world outside was a mirror of itself, stretched and warped in subtle ways, reflecting an image that made no sense. I wanted to get off. I had to get off. But when I approached the door, the woman's gaze followed me, unblinking, and I froze. I do not remember exactly what happened next, only that the train began to slow. The whispers grew louder, pressing against my ears and chest, until I could not tell whether I was moving or being moved, whether the rain outside was falling or rising, whether I was still awake or trapped inside some unending echo of reality. Eventually, the train stopped completely once more. I sank back into my seat, exhausted, feeling the weight of 1,000 silent eyes pressing on me from the corners of the car. And she was gone. Just vanished, as though she had never been there at all, leaving only the faintest chill in the air and the sound of irregular tapping somewhere deep inside the metal walls. When I finally stepped out, when I thought I stepped out, the platform was empty, drenched in silver rain. There were no passengers, no conductors, no guards. Just the endless hum of water dripping, distant thunder, and the faint reflection of the car where it should not have been. And I understood, with a sinking certainty, that the train had stopped moving long before I entered, that perhaps it had never intended to carry me anywhere at all. I have not taken that line since. I have not boarded another train at night. But sometimes, when the rain falls softly and the streets shimmer in silver, I swear I can hear the faintest hiss of wheels over tracks, the softest whisper echoing, "Welcome back." And I wonder, if I ever step onto a train again, will it move, or will I simply be trapped once more in its endless, mirrored journey? I had never liked bridges. There was something about the way they arched over the water, suspended between two places yet belonging fully to neither, that unsettled me. That night, rain had begun to fall in steady sheets, drumming a quiet, persistent rhythm on the roof of my car as I drove through the outskirts of the city. The bridge loomed ahead, long and narrow, slick with wet asphalt that glimmered under the dim streetlights. My mind was restless, and yet, for reasons I cannot explain, I chose to cross it. The first time, everything seemed ordinary. The streetlights flickered faintly, and the wind carried a sharp, wet scent, but the air felt heavy with anticipation, as if the bridge itself were holding its breath. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, noticing the water below roiling with tiny ripples that reflected the dim light, endlessly moving but never quite the same pattern twice. The rain fell harder, tapping a syncopated rhythm against the windshield, a gentle hypnotic percussion that seemed to slow time. As I drove, I felt a faint tingle at the back of my neck, a sensation like invisible eyes tracing me. I glanced to the edges of the bridge, half expecting to see someone standing in the rain, but there was nothing. Only the mist rising off the water, curling in strange, almost human shapes. I chalked it up to my imagination, the way shadows blur when the mind is too focused on anticipation. Yet, a part of me kept insisting that I should not have come here, that the bridge did not want me to cross. By the time I reached the middle, the rain had turned into a steady downpour, washing over the bridge and blurring the yellow lines into ghostly streaks. The sound of tires slicing through puddles was the only sound I could hear, besides the constant whisper of water against the supports below. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, there was another sound, a faint tapping, irregular, almost like footsteps, but lighter, softer, and not coming from the direction of the road. I paused, heart tightening, straining to hear over the rain. The sound continued, persistent, echoing in a rhythm that didn't match mine. One felt a sudden chill. Something about the air had changed. It was colder, sharper, like the bridge itself had exhaled. When I finally reached the other side, the lights flickered violently, then steadied. I told myself it was a trick of the storm, a momentary reflection of electricity in wet air. But the uneasy feeling lingered as I drove away. The city lights seemed duller, the rain heavier. I did not think much of it at the time, but later, when recounting the night to a friend, I mentioned the strange feeling on the bridge, the steps, the cold, and she looked at me with a small, knowing frown. The bridge, she said softly, almost reverently. Some people say it doesn't like being crossed the same way twice. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. I was tired, and perhaps the storm had frayed my nerves. Yet curiosity, that stubborn itch, gnawed at me. A week later, I found myself back at the same bridge, under another storm, another dark, dripping sky. The rain was gentler this time, more insistent, like the air itself was pressing down. I entered the bridge slowly, trying to notice everything I had seen before. But almost immediately I realized it was not the same. The road seemed narrower, the streetlights stretched taller and further apart. The water below was darker, almost opaque, reflecting faint glimmers like distant, moving eyes. I gripped the wheel tightly, noticing the railings seemed higher, the metal slicker, and the mist curling in unnatural angles that no wind should have been able to create. A soft whisper reached me. I couldn't tell if it came from inside my car or from the space around me. A sibilant, drawn-out sound that I could not parse. The rain intensified, beating on the roof and hood in a rhythm that seemed to mock me, rising and falling like some hidden heartbeat. I slowed the car, eyes darting to the edges, half expecting to see someone or something. But again, there was nothing. Only a flicker in the corner of my vision, a shadow stretching unnaturally, elongating along the curve of the bridge, moving in a way that defied logic. I blinked and it was gone, but the memory of its presence remained, prickling the hairs on my arms. By the time I reached the midpoint, the whispers became more insistent. They were not words, not sentences, but a low, vibrating sound that seemed to curl around the tires, seep into the engine, into the very air I breathed. My chest tightened, and my palms were damp with sweat. The mist below thickened, swirling in spirals, forming shapes that suggested figures, or faces, that disappeared as soon as I looked directly at them. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to slow the car, to remind myself it was still raining, that the storm, that my mind, was making things appear. But a part of me, deep and unreasonably, knew that I was not imagining it. Something about this bridge had changed. I had changed. When I reached the far side, the lights flickered and hummed, and the bridge stretched slightly longer, each puddle reflecting an unfamiliar pattern, a landscape subtly warped. I parked my car for a moment, listening. There was a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a tiny shifting, like the road itself was rearranging. I dared not move. I felt the air thicken, as if I were stepping into a living thing. And in that instant, I could swear I saw a figure standing just past the end of the bridge, shrouded in mist, staring at me. Its features were unclear, but the presence felt intentional, patient, waiting. I blinked and it was gone, yet the memory of being observed lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I drove away quickly, heart hammering, focusing on the wet asphalt, the dull gray world beyond the bridge. Yet, in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something strange. The bridge behind me seemed slightly off, darker, its supports bending at impossible angles. I shook my head, telling myself I was being silly, that the rain and the adrenaline were fooling me. But even as I drove into the city, I could not rid myself of the sensation that the bridge had watched me, had learned me, and was changing in response. That night, I lay awake, listening to the steady patter of rain against my window, and I realized I could hear it still. A faint, almost imperceptible tapping, like steps echoing over wet metal. I told myself it was in my head, that I had imagined it. Yet when I closed my eyes, I could see it. The bridge stretching endlessly. The water below black and glimmering. Shadows flickering just out of reach. And the whisper. Insistent, patient, almost inviting. I have never crossed that bridge again. I do not intend to. Yet sometimes, on nights when the rain falls just so, I think I hear it in the distance. A soft, wet rhythm, carrying the faintest whisper of something not quite human, and I cannot help but wonder, if I ever do return, if it will be the same bridge I once crossed, or if it will have changed again, waiting, learning, ready to show me something I was never meant to see. Because bridges, I have learned, are not just places to travel over. They are thresholds. And sometimes, they remember. It happened just after midnight, the kind of hour when even the city seems to lose its rhythm. I remember the silence most of all, that thin, trembling quiet that hangs in the air right before something happens. The night had been calm until then. The rain earlier had left everything slick and shining under the pale glow of the streetlights, and the smell of wet asphalt filled the air. I was walking home. My path was familiar, the same narrow street I'd walked 100 times before. The air was cool against my face, and the soft hum of electricity from the streetlights above was oddly comforting. Each pool of light felt like a small island in an endless dark sea, and I moved from one to the next, my footsteps echoing faintly on the damp pavement. About halfway down the block, I stopped for a moment. I don't know why. Maybe it was the feeling that I wasn't alone, or maybe it was just the way the night air shifted, heavier, thicker. The street stretched ahead of me, quiet and empty. Every window was dark, every car parked still. I told myself it was fine, that I was imagining things. And then the streetlight above me flickered once. A faint buzz. A brief flare of brightness, and then darkness. The sound cut out too. No hum, no electricity, nothing. It was as if the world had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. I blinked, waiting for my eyes to adjust, but the dark felt absolute, like someone had draped the whole street in velvet. My pulse quickened, though I didn't know why. I'd been in the dark before. It shouldn't have felt like this. Then I saw it, a shape. Just beyond the edge of where the last working streetlight glowed, someone or something was standing there, in the gap between light and shadow. At first, I thought it might be another person walking home, caught by the same outage. But as I squinted, my stomach sank. Whoever it was hadn't moved. They were just standing there, still watching. I told myself not to stare, that I was being ridiculous. It could have been a lamppost, a parked car, anything. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that it wasn't an object. It was a figure, tall, faintly outlined against the dim spill of light from the next street over. I couldn't see their face, or even what they were wearing, but I could feel their attention on me. It was like the air between us had changed, charged with something unseen. I stepped back, my shoes scraping softly against the pavement. The sound echoed down the empty street. The figure didn't move. For a moment, I considered calling out. Maybe it really was just someone waiting, someone as startled as I was. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight, my body frozen in place. All I could do was watch. And then the next light, further down the street, flickered. Just once, and in that single blink of light, the figure was gone. The space where it had been was empty now, swallowed by the darkness. I felt my heart drop into my stomach. I turned, scanning the other side of the street, half expecting to see them standing closer. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I started walking again, faster this time. My footsteps sounded too loud in the silence, bouncing off the wet walls of the buildings. I tried not to look behind me, but it was impossible not to feel that weight, that pull of awareness that comes when you know you're being watched. The next streetlight ahead flickered to. For a fraction of a second, the whole block went dark again, and in that darkness, just before the light snapped back on, I saw them. Closer now, standing halfway between where I'd been and where I was going. Still, watching, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't run. I couldn't. My body wouldn't let me. Every instinct screamed to move, to get away, but I was rooted in place, locked in some quiet understanding that running wouldn't matter. When the light came back, they were gone again. I don't remember how I made it home. I remember unlocking my door with shaking hands, closing it behind me, and leaning against it, my chest tight and my pulse pounding. The silence inside my apartment was almost unbearable. I turned on every light I could find, the kitchen, the hallway, even the bathroom. And that's when I saw it. Through the window, just across the street, under the same broken streetlight, a figure stood, perfectly still, head tilted slightly upward, looking directly at my window. The light flickered once more, and this time, when it went dark, it didn't come back on. It happened on a day that felt neither real nor unreal, one of those overcast afternoons when the light is soft and gray, and time moves like a slow river you can't quite see. I remember the way she looked at me before I left, how her eyes, normally so calm, carried something else that day. Something like fear. She stood by the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, and said softly, almost pleadingly, "Don't go down that path." Her voice lingered even after I'd stepped outside, carried by the breeze that smelled faintly of rain and rust. I didn't understand why she said it. The path she meant was nothing unusual, just the old trail that wound through the woods behind the house, the one that eventually led to the fields. I'd walked it many times before. It was quiet there, peaceful, a place where the noise of the world seemed to fade away. So I went. The air felt heavier than usual as I started down the trail, and the sky had deepened into a strange shade between blue and gray. The trees were taller than I remembered, their branches curving inward until they seemed to form a canopy that shut out most of the light. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the damp earth beneath me. Everything smelled of rain and moss. As I walked, I noticed the silence. Not the normal kind that comes in quiet places, but the kind that feels constructed, engineered. The birds weren't singing. The wind had stopped moving through the leaves. Even the distant hum of the town was gone. It was as though the world had been paused, and I was the only one still moving. I told myself it was fine, that maybe a storm was coming, and the forest was simply bracing itself. But then I saw it, the fog. It began low, near the ground at first, rolling slowly between the trees like something alive. It wasn't the kind of mist that drifts softly. It was thicker, heavier, like smoke, and it moved against the breeze. I stopped walking and watched it spread across the trail, curling around the trunks of trees, swallowing the path ahead. Something inside me said to turn back. Her voice, faint but clear, whispered again, "Don't go down that path." But I couldn't stop. There was something magnetic about the fog, something that pulled me toward it. So I stepped forward, one slow step at a time, and let it swallow me whole. The air changed instantly. It was colder here, sharper. My breath came out in small clouds, even though it hadn't been that cold before. The forest looked different too. The trees were taller, now massive, their bark blackened and cracked, as if they'd been burned long ago. The leaves overhead were darker, almost blue, and the light that filtered through them had no warmth to it. I turned around to look back, but the path I'd come from was gone. The fog had thickened into a wall behind me. The way home had vanished. I don't know how long I walked. Time didn't feel real anymore. The trail twisted and shifted beneath me, sometimes narrowing so much that I had to press myself between the trees, and sometimes opening into wide stretches of dark meadow lit only by faint patches of luminescence that shimmered on the ground. I remember passing things that didn't belong: an old wooden chair standing alone in the middle of the trail, a doorframe with no wall attached to it, its hinges creaking softly though there was no wind. I passed a mirror leaning against a tree, its surface fogged over, and when I wiped it clean, my reflection didn't move. It just stared at me, motionless, before tilting its head ever so slightly. That's when I realized where I wasn't new. It wasn't another place at all. It was the same world, just seen from the other side. I could feel it in my bones, in the air that hummed with a low frequency I could almost hear. The world was still there, but distorted. Familiar shapes were wrong. Familiar sounds echoed differently. Even my own footsteps had a delay, as though time itself was hesitating before catching up to me. Eventually, I came to a clearing. In the center stood a house, my house. Same structure, same windows, even the same dent in the roof where a branch had fallen last winter. But it wasn't my house. The paint was darker, and the windows seemed too deep, too reflective, like eyes. There was light inside, a faint golden glow that flickered like candlelight, and in the window she was there. She was standing exactly where she had been that morning, one hand resting on the glass, looking out at me. Her face was calm, but her eyes were different now. They were hollow, like someone had taken the light out of them. And when she smiled slowly, gently, it wasn't the smile I remembered. It was too wide, too knowing. I should have run. I should have looked away. But I didn't. She lifted her hand and beckoned me closer. I took a step forward, then another, until I was at the front door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. The metal was cold, colder than anything I'd ever touched. For a moment, I hesitated, her voice echoing in my mind again, "Don't go down that path." But it was too late. I opened the door. The air inside was warm, almost comforting, and the house looked exactly the same as mine. The same furniture, the same photographs on the walls, the same faint smell of lavender that always lingered in the air. For a second, I almost believed I'd somehow made it back. But then I noticed the photograph by the stairs, the one of the two of us smiling. Except in this version, my face was turned slightly away from the camera, and hers. Hers was still smiling, but her eyes were fixed on me, as if she knew I'd be looking. And that's when it hit me. She had told me not to go, not because she was afraid for me, but because she already knew what I would find. Because she had gone before, and she hadn't come back. Now, when I stand at the edge of that path and look into the trees, I can still see the faint shimmer of fog drifting between them. Sometimes, I hear her voice on the wind, calling my name, not a warning anymore, but an invitation. And sometimes, when I turn to leave, I see the house again, barely visible through the trees. Its windows glowing softly, like eyes waiting. It began on an afternoon that felt unusually heavy, the kind of day when the air itself seems reluctant to move. I had set out for a walk, something I often did when my thoughts grew too tangled to keep still. The city was quiet, draped in a light mist that softened the edges of everything, buildings, trees, even people. The world looked half asleep, and I liked it that way. I didn't plan a route that day. I just walked, turning whenever I felt like it, following whichever path seemed to pull me. Sometimes I took the streets I knew. Other times I wandered into ones I didn't. I told myself it didn't matter where I ended up. All that mattered was that I kept moving forward. At some point, I came to a crossroads I didn't recognize. 3 streets stretched out before me, each looking equally ordinary, equally unremarkable. The lamps along them glowed faintly in the mist, halos of amber light trembling in the fog. I chose the middle one, mostly because it seemed the brightest, and kept walking. The sound of my footsteps on the damp pavement echoed faintly, rhythmic and soft. The buildings here were taller, their windows dark. I could smell rain in the cracks of the stone and hear the faint hum of something distant. Traffic, maybe, though it felt too far away to be real. I remember thinking how easy it was to get lost in a city this quiet. How easy it was to disappear into it. After what felt like 20 minutes, I turned a corner and stopped. I knew this place. The same square of cracked pavement by the lamppost. The same flickering neon sign across the street. The same narrow alley with the green dumpster at the end. I had been here before, not just earlier today, but many times, on many walks. It was familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. I stood there for a moment, trying to piece together how I could have looped back so quickly. Maybe I had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Maybe I just hadn't been paying attention. I shrugged it off and tried again. I turned down a different street this time, deliberately watching every corner, every sign, every landmark. The air grew heavier as I walked, the mist thickening until the world seemed to fold in on itself. I took turns I didn't remember taking, crossed intersections that didn't feel real, until the streets themselves began to blur. And then, just like before, I was back. The same street, the same lamppost, the same cracked pavement. I stood there longer this time, the unease rising slowly in my chest. My hands were cold. The light above me flickered, and the hum of electricity filled the air. It wasn't just déjà vu anymore. It was something deeper, heavier, like the city itself had quietly shifted beneath me, rearranging its bones while I wasn't looking. I told myself it was fine. I'd find a way out. I just had to keep trying. So I walked again. Each time I left, I chose a different path. The street to the right, the alley between buildings, even the narrow passage that cut behind the shops. Each time, I told myself this one will be different. But no matter which direction I chose, no matter how far I walked, I always ended up here. The same cracked pavement, the same lamppost, the same flickering sign. I began to notice small things changing though. Subtle details that didn't quite match what I remembered. The flickering sign across the street sometimes spelled a different word, the letters rearranged. The lamppost leaned a little more each time I saw it, the cracks in the pavement spreading wider. And once, just once, I thought I saw someone standing at the end of the street. A shadow, tall and still, its head tilted slightly toward me. When I blinked, it was gone. I don't know how long I walked. Time felt meaningless there. The air grew thicker with every loop, and the sound of my footsteps began to echo differently, slower, heavier, like someone was walking just a half step behind me. I turned once, fast, expecting to see someone, anyone, but there was nothing. Only the mist and the empty street, watching me in silence. Eventually, I stopped trying to leave. I sat on the curb beneath the lamppost and stared at the cracks in the ground. They looked deeper now, dark and endless, as though they led somewhere I couldn't see. The city was quiet. No wind, no sound. No life, just me and the faint, distant hum of something that might have been breathing. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point I must have, because when I opened my eyes again, the mist had lifted. The street looked different, brighter, clearer. The sign across the road wasn't flickering anymore. For a moment, I thought I had broken the loop. I stood up and turned around, ready to finally go home, and that's when I saw it. Another lamppost. Another cracked square of pavement. Another sign, flickering faintly in the distance. Except this time, I was standing where the shadow had been, and across the street, beneath the lamppost I had sat under for so long. Someone else was there, sitting exactly where I had been, their head bowed, their shoulders hunched. When they looked up, I saw my own face staring back at me. I blinked, and the street went quiet again. The mist began to rise, and I started walking. I moved into the apartment on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of gray day that makes everything feel suspended in time. The building was old, but clean. The walls painted a faint off-white that reflected too much light during the day and too little at night. My unit was small, just one bedroom, a kitchen, and a single large window that overlooked the street. I remember thinking that the window was the best part of the place. It stretched almost from floor to ceiling, and in the afternoons, the light poured in, soft and golden, wrapping the room in warmth. The first few nights were uneventful. I slept lightly, waking often to the muffled hum of the city outside, the passing cars, the rustle of leaves, the quiet rhythm of life beyond the glass. But on the fourth night, something shifted. I woke around 3, the air unusually still. The rain that had begun earlier in the evening had stopped, and the world outside seemed frozen. I rolled over, glancing toward the window, and that's when I saw it. The city beyond the glass wasn't the one I knew. The streets were darker, narrower. The lampposts glowed a dull orange instead of white. The buildings across the road were older, taller, their windows dim and curtained. There were no cars, no people, no sound, just that faint, strange light seeping through the mist. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat echoing too loud in the silence. I blinked hard, once, twice, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. But the scene didn't change. It remained still, painted in impossible color. I stood and moved closer. My reflection was faint, distorted by the glass, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind it, a shadow, slow and deliberate, out of sync with me. I leaned in until my breath fogged the window. The air on the other side shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt, but it was cold in the room. My hand hovered near the glass, and though I didn't touch it, I swear I felt something on the other side, a vibration, faint and alive. I told myself I was tired. That's all. I went back to bed, forcing my eyes closed, and after what felt like hours, I drifted off. When I awoke, sunlight filled the room and the city outside was back to normal. The traffic, the colors, the life. For a while, I almost convinced myself I had dreamed it. But that night, when darkness fell again, I found myself glancing at the window more often than I meant to. Around the same time, 3 o'clock, maybe 3:15, I woke up again. This time, I didn't move. I just opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling, waiting. I don't know how long it took, but I heard it, a faint, rhythmic hum, low and pulsing, like the sound of electricity buried deep underground. I turned my head toward the window. The light outside had changed again. It wasn't orange this time. It was blue, a deep, unnatural shade that painted everything in cold tones. The city beyond the glass was different once more. The streets had rearranged. Buildings leaned at strange angles, and the sky. The sky wasn't dark. It was pale, almost white, as if morning and night had blurred together. My stomach twisted. I knew that what I was seeing wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But it was there, clear as anything. I forced myself to look away, to find something familiar. The reflection in the glass, maybe, to anchor myself. But when I turned toward the window again, my reflection wasn't there. Instead, something else stood in its place. A darker silhouette, tall, featureless, motionless. I froze. It didn't move when I did. It just stood there, where my reflection should have been, facing me, separated only by a thin pane of glass. I don't remember how long I stared at it. Maybe minutes. Maybe longer. The hum grew louder, resonating in my chest like a second heartbeat. And then, very slowly, the figure lifted its hand. For a second, I thought it was mirroring me, but my hands were still at my sides. The shape's movement was deliberate, intentional, independent. Its hand touched the inside of the glass, or what should have been inside, and for a moment, I saw the faintest outline of fingers pressing outward from the other side. I stumbled back. My chair scraped against the floor, loud in the silence. And then, just as suddenly, the light changed. The room was dark again, the reflection normal, the city outside exactly as it should be. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, I walked down to the street and looked up at my window from outside. It was just glass, clean, unbroken, ordinary. But as I stood there, staring, I noticed something strange. My window reflected the street, the passing cars, the buildings across the way, all normal, except for one thing. There was a faint figure standing in the reflection, near where I would have been inside. A dark outline, unmoving. I looked up at the real window. The apartment was empty. That night, I kept the curtains closed. I told myself I wouldn't look again. I tried reading, keeping the light on, listening to the quiet sounds of the world beyond my room. But sometime after 3, I felt it again, that pressure in the air, that subtle vibration, like the hum of something vast and hidden pressing against the edges of perception. My skin prickled. Against my will, my eyes drifted toward the curtains. I could see faint light filtering through the fabric. I stood and approached slowly, heart pounding, my fingers trembling as I reached out. I told myself not to, that I didn't need to know. But I pulled the curtain aside. The city outside was gone. In its place stretched an expanse of still water, black as oil, reflecting a skyline that wasn't mine. The buildings were taller, sharper, built of glass and shadow. The sky above was divided, half red, half gray, bleeding into each other like paint on wet paper. The air beyond the glass shimmered, vibrating, alive. And there, in the reflection of that impossible city, stood the same dark figure, facing me from a world I did not belong to. It raised its hand again, palm flat against the inside of the glass. The faintest outline of fingers pressed outward, and this time, the glass beneath my palm felt warm. I stumbled back, the curtain falling shut. The hum faded, slowly, as though retreating into the walls. I didn't sleep. I didn't move until dawn. I've covered the window since then. Blankets, boards, anything to keep it hidden. But sometimes, when the night is quiet, I hear it again, the low hum, faint and distant, vibrating through the glass. And I know that behind that barrier, beyond that reflection, the city still waits. Because I've realized something. The figure in the window isn't trying to frighten me. It's trying to replace me.